Hey, hey. All right. Can you all hear me? All right. Hi, I'm Mark. I'm here from BitGo. I'm going to talk a little bit about unspent management and hopefully, too loud? Oh. Louder?
Closer to the mic.
No, I'm mic'd up. Thanks. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about unspent management and hopefully how you can save on fees. And then, well, I'll take your questions after that. So first I'll start with what is a UTXO actually, right? And you probably, well, who's familiar with what a UTXO is in the first place? All right, that's a pretty good yield already. UTXOs are what floats around in the Bitcoin space and what actually holds all the money. And it is uniquely identifiable pieces of Bitcoin that we then reference in order to spend money. You can see at the top there's the output ID, and the output ID is composed of two parts. The first part is the transaction ID of the transaction that created a transaction output. The second part, the 3 here after the colon, is the position in the output list. And since transaction IDs are unique, we therefore have a unique identifier for these pieces of Bitcoin that are floating about. Other meta information that's interesting on UTXOs, unspent transaction outputs, or I'll probably call them unspent a few times also, so that's what I mean, is like when was this unspent created, what address got paid, and how much Bitcoin is it worth in Satoshis, and then there's two maybe more obscure ones, which are witness script and redeem script. So given that this has a witness script and a redeem script, can somebody tell me what address format this is? It's a wrapped SegWit, yeah. All right. So it has a redeem script, which means it is a pay-to-script hash. And inside there's a witness program. And these two parts are how you authenticate that you're the owner of that money and that you can spend it. So you have to fulfill this witness program and this redeem script in order to send those funds. So why do you care about UTXOs in the first place? People use UTXOs to validate whether whether the money that transactions are spending exists, and whether the transactions are not double spends or money is being spent twice, or money that doesn't exist is being spent. And so all the full nodes in the Bitcoin network track all pieces of Bitcoin, all these UTXOs. Every single full node has a full list of all of these. And as you can see, we're currently at about 57.5 million unspent transaction outputs. And we actually were higher already, but we used to be a lot lower. This is the last 5 years. And for the first 3 years, it doubled every year, the count of Bitcoin pieces. And then it slowed down a bit because people started realizing that it's pretty expensive to have their funds fragmented across all sorts of small, little, tiny pieces of Bitcoin. And they started to consolidate a little more and start looking into unspent management. And then you see this huge run-up. And you might remember December 2017. What happened there? Well, Bitcoin price went up to almost 20,000 US dollars, and people were speculating like mad, and there was a ton of transactions. There was always a huge backlog of transactions, and fees went up to almost 1,000 Satoshis per byte. So a lot of the unspents that were such tiny little pieces, they were completely unspendable, economically unspendable, because their value was lower than the fees that you had to pay to include them into a transaction. So actually, when the fees subsided a little bit and went down in January, people consolidated a lot, and that's what you see here. The global UTXO set shrunk and then was relatively stable for a while as people learned, oh my God, this is so expensive, I can't have my money spread so thin, and adopted some better practices. So I'm a little distraught that now the UTXO set is growing again. And I'm wondering whether people are starting to forget about December 2017, or whether there's just so many new people coming into Bitcoin and creating additional pieces of Bitcoin that are floating around. Well, you might wonder, why do unspends even affect fees? When you create a Bitcoin transaction, you have to pay for each piece of Bitcoin you're spending. And it doesn't matter whether it's a whole Bitcoin or whether it's a millibitcoin. You always pay for the data that you are trying to write to the Bitcoin blockchain. And this then results in a backlog of transactions, the mempool, which exists individually on every full node, but is mostly the same across all full nodes because they exchange information with each other. And you might see, so you see the colors here. You can probably not read the labels, but I'll walk you through it. The x-axis is time. The y-axis is megabytes waiting to be included in the blockchain. And the colors are fee levels. So blue is up to about 10 to 12 satoshis per byte. Green is up to 40 satoshis. And yellow is up to 140 satoshis per byte. So you see that how from almost empty on, say, just before June 20th, the big run-up, the last big run-up, it was almost empty. And then it immediately went to over 100 satoshis per byte. And this is because people are trying to always be in the next block. And they don't really think much about, hey, when do I actually need this payment to confirm? And they're just going with the defaults maybe that are set. And then suddenly there is this huge roof of very expensive transactions that always quickly appear because everybody is sending for, I want to be in the next block. And you can see that if I'm now removing all the transactions below 20 satoshis per byte, and you still see there's almost nothing left and right, and then suddenly there's huge spikes, and it's even worse across above 70 satoshis per byte. It's just, people are completely overbidding immediately because they're not properly signaling their time preference. So if you're running a wallet that regularly sends transactions, I think the first way that you want to think about building transactions and sending money is, when does this actually need to be confirmed? Do I have until tomorrow morning? Well, then maybe I can go with a low fee that will confirm overnight. When I need this, do I really need this in the next block? Can I maybe wait a few minutes to see if there's a few more withdrawals that I can serve in one transaction, and then batch maybe 5 payments into a single transaction, only create one change output, only select inputs once, and then save on overhead there. You should, when the fees are low, or even when the fees are not low, create some consolidation transactions that just sit at very low fee rates. So when the mempool clears down to that, you can get the benefit of consolidating a lot of tiny pieces for very little money into a bigger unspend that's useful at higher fees later. And then there's something that I learned about when I read about it, and when I wrote that, right? I did my master thesis on coin selection, so this is a topic where you deal with how do I build the input set for a transaction in looking at fees in the long term and in the short term. And if you, for example, at high fees, always minimize your input set, but at low fees, you are more lenient and allow more inputs, you'll naturally consolidate some of your tiny pieces already. And you can try to create transactions such that they don't have a change output, and thus save in fees already, because a change output means that you'll have to create another input later in order to spend funds. So it creates an obligation to your own wallet to pay further fees later. And then one thing that is very dear to my heart is you should always use the most efficient address formats that are available to you. I've prepared an example here. Oh, sorry, this one. I work at BitGo. We do multi-sig wallets. We always have 2 or 3 multi-sig. And when we started our service in 2013, we started out with pay-to-script hash, which you might be familiar with. And an input for a pay-to-script hash and 2 or 3 multi-sig is 297 bytes. So roughly twice that of a standard pay-to-public key hash. And when SegWit came out in 2017, we very quickly adopted that and offered wrapped SegWit addresses. which already reduced the input size to 140 bytes. So more than 50% savings when you got paid to a wrapped SegWit address instead of a paid to a script hash address. Early this year, we got native SegWit, and that drops it another 25% from wrapped SegWit. And I'm very much looking forward to Schnorr, which may or may not be here this or next year, which will allow us to do multi-sig that looks like a single sig. And it will actually be super inexpensive. But you see that already wrapped SegWit is cheaper than a traditional single sig send. And so what I want to highlight here is you should always adopt these new protocol improvements because you'll be actually saving a lot of money. We calculated this for one of our customers and recommended to them that they were doing a lot of transactions, and we were able to tell them that they would save some $20,000 a month. They said, we'll switch next week. So you might want to look into that too if you're running a big wallet. So to sum it all up, I would like you, if you're running a big wallet especially, to rethink your time preference. I bought myself something a month ago. I looked at the invoice, it said within 12 hours, so I took a very low fee and it worked out just fine. It went in much quicker. You can save money that way. And do adopt protocol updates as soon as you can. Do you have any questions?
Okay, we've got about 5 minutes for questions. I'm actually going to kick it off with a question of my own. I'm curious, when you're looking at these huge spikes in UTXOs and on-chain fees, how much of that do you think has to do with exchanges that are not batching their own transactions? And then on top of that, what exchanges do you see as being really good at adopting the next wave of transaction batching, and which ones are kind of bad at it?
Well, so batching has been around a while, and I think it has been adopted pretty successfully meanwhile. I know of one example where somebody is batching once a minute, but they tend to have less than one transaction per minute, so I wouldn't call that batching anymore because 90% of their transactions are single sends. So I think that a lot of people overestimate the urgency with which their customers want their money. And they can just pop up a message, your withdrawal is getting processed, and then send out 10 payments in one transaction after 10 minutes instead of one every minute. So, well, you could name names. There's an industry giant that still hasn't gotten batching to work, which you're probably aiming at, but their problem is that they built their whole system with the assumption one payment is one transaction, and it's really difficult to change that on all levels. Besides that, I think people should really make an effort. You can, David Harding had a great blog post on this. He estimates that you can save about 7/8 of the fees, so there should be plenty of incentive for someone to spend a week on that or something. Regarding the new address formats, we recently saw a little uptick in paid-to-witness script hash. I'm very excited about. I think that maybe a few people are wary because it's difficult. Not every wallet can send to paid-to-witness script hash yet. That's Bash32 addresses or native SegWit addresses. And I think that people can do some detection there and know when they can send and just try it first, and it'll get adopted soonish. But right now, it's just a little bit a chicken and an egg problem. Also, the savings are just not quite as big as with wrapped SegWit.
Okay, so when we see this big spike in the transaction fees and stuff, and it drops back down, you mentioned about coin consolidation and trying to break all your coins together. But on the other hand, we have people discussing things like coin shuffle and coin join. And at the end of the day, there's a lot of people that are probably just a bit scared to just move them back together because of the privacy break and that. I mean, is there any feasible way to get around this with actually coin consolidation and looking at coin shuffle and coin join and having these things work together in harmony?
So I'm going to try to repeat your question because I'm not entirely sure I got it all. But you're asking about the privacy of batching versus like coin joins and stuff like that?
Well, no, the consolidation of
and
outputs
consolidation,
together against
So
coin joins.
obviously
essentially.
consolidation will create a lot of common input taint. But if we're honest, a lot of exchanges don't seem to care too much about that because all of their users are, or a lot of their users are doing address reuse anyway. They got a deposit address from their exchange and they keep sending to that same address over and over. And when that exchange does a withdrawal and spends from that address with 15 others, it's very easy to cluster the addresses of the exchange. So it's difficult from the perspective of an exchange to improve the behavior of customers there because the customers have the work, but they don't have the benefit, right? Well, except if maybe Chris Belcher had this example at Breaking Bitcoin. If you send 1,000 Bitcoin to a Bitcoin exchange and everybody knows that you're depositing a shit ton of money to a Bitcoin exchange, the market might move against you, anticipating that and shorting the market, right? So there's a little bit of an incentive there, but it's not nearly strong enough to change the behavior of the broad user base. Regarding consolidations, I think that especially given the adoption of branch and bound in Bitcoin Core and also on our own code base and in Bitcoin.js, which builds transactions that do not have a change output, it becomes a little more difficult to properly distinguish consolidation transactions from single sends that don't have a change output. So my hope is that in the long run, this will perhaps dilute that a little bit so that people don't know whether that single output went to your own wallet or to a different participant in the network. And then maybe stuff like pay join, as in pay to endpoint, would help a bit because it's completely indistinguishable from a send where people are sending multiple inputs to one person or sorry, I should probably explain what pay to endpoint is. The recipient puts up a second input to the transaction and increases the amount that is being sent to him. Say, you're sending me 1 Bitcoin, I send 4 Bitcoins with your 1 Bitcoin to myself and receive 5 Bitcoin. So I'm doing a mini consolidation with one of my inputs and your input, and that dilutes this common input heuristic, and it's absolutely indistinguishable from other sends that just happen to have multiple inputs. So I think there's a few interesting things that we can do to make the life of chain analysis companies harder, but there's just not enough will to do that right now, I think.
All right,
next to you?
and we have time for one more question.
Andrew.
Yes, Merch. So, quick question. So I think that a lot of people make noise about like blockchain scalability with large blocks. I think one thing is like, how scalable is the UTXO set and like how computers can handle that. My question for you is like, if we implement Schnorr, like how effective and how efficient would that be? And like how big can the UTXO get in terms of like how many addresses or how many people you think that it could fit?
All right. So the question is how much more efficient does the UTXO set become when we use Schnorr? And I would argue that it doesn't really become much more scalable because you still have to track all those pieces, whether they're in Schnorr pub keys or in Bitcoin pay to whatever addresses. So the tracking all the UTXOs, the problem with that is this is what full nodes use to validate whether a transaction actually has the funds and is not a double spend and all that. So usually the full nodes want to keep that in memory in order to be able to very quickly validate. And I don't think that is affected by Schnorr. Schnorr has a lot of benefits in other ways, though. So for example, it makes transactions generally smaller because Schnorr signatures are smaller than ECDSA signatures. There's all these possibilities where you can combine multiple keys into a single key. There's music, which does it for n of n, or generally any binomial monotonic sets that do not have, that don't need accountability. It'll just look like a valid send, so you cannot distinguish who signed for it. But you can have very complex constructs that all combine down to a single public key. And then there's constructions like the one that we will be using. We need accountability, right? We have 2 or 3 keys with the customer or the recovery service. So we have to tell, was it a recovery or was it one that we signed ourselves? It's important for us. So I'm getting some feedback right now. Okay. So what you need is accountability. You need to be able to tell who paid. And with Schnorr, you can do a taproot construction. So we'll have the standard case where the BitGo key signs with the hot wallet key in the root, and it'll look like a single sig. And that's why I project this to be only 58 vbytes. But in the recovery cases, that's why there's an asterisk. It'll be a little bigger because you have to reveal, oh, it's a taproot. I have to reveal the leaf that I'm signing and the hashing partner of the leaf. And then I think it ends up being something like 106 bytes. So it's still extremely cheap. But yeah, there's that. All right. Cool. Thank you.